Hi, this is Scott Bradfield. Welcome to the bathtub. This week, we're going to do a few weeks of just kind of relatively light reading, stuff that just bathtub reading, and mix up the genres a bit. Last week I did a terrible attempt to explain why Doc Smith is sort of worth reading, and I may try him again. This week I'm going to try something semi-light because it's coming from a fairly serious and important writer. Most of us have grown up knowing 100 Years of Solitude by the great Gabriel Garcia Marquez. He was born in Colombia, but he moved around quite a bit. He's sort of an international writer or a South American writer. I don't think he lived in Colombia much. He lived in Mexico, lived in Europe. And this book, influenced a lot of us, I think. I think I read this when I was 18 years old. It was one of the first, I remember it was one of the first books I read by somebody who was alive that was a serious writer. Because up until then, I either read, Tolstoy or science fiction or detective stories. And, it was like a living writer who wrote really substantial work. And it was amazing. It was an eye-opening book. You couldn't put it down. Many people in the 40 years since I read this book, or 50 years since I read this book, have enjoyed it. And I've passed it on to many, many people in my life. I wanted to go read through. He's one of the writers I like to read through. If I live to be a million, we'll read through a number of writers who I like. And he's one of them I would like to go back and check out. So last week I went back and reread a book of his, which I think is his first two books. And was originally published in America as No One Writes to the Colonel and Other Stories. And apparently it's two very early short books by Marquez. One, that title story, which is sort of a novella length, maybe 20,000 word novel. And then a book of stories called Big Mama's Funeral. And they're really quite a pleasure to read them. He's really a good narrative, basic, character-oriented writer. He reminds me a lot of, you can think of him in the same light as Hemingway or William Trevor, a writer who really, in these early stories, focuses on his characters. They're pretty sad sack, unhappy people. Mainly they're financially unhappy. They're all broke. They all live in these terrible, most of it takes place in the early days of his creation of Macondo, which is this small Central American country, in which almost the entirety of Solitude is set. Again, that's a big phantasmagoric, multi-generational history of a typical South American country and how it's destroyed, basically, by banana companies and all the horrible people who probably still destroy it. But many years before that, he wrote these early stories, which are, they're not preliminary. They're very much the stories of a young man, very clever, very well written. They're the sort of stories I'm always trying to get my students to write. My students often, they come into my class, they never publish a story, and they all want to write 100 Years of Solitude. I just feel like hitting them on the head with it. And they all, I'm writing this big multi-perspective novel, and it's going to be 3 books. It's a trilogy. It's going to go on for 800 pages. And they all want to write this, and it's going to be magic realism, blah, blah. And this is, again, it's such a really good history to look at a good writer who writes this after many years of writing. So, 10 or 15 years after he's writing the stories in these first 2 collections, and he has another collection, Leaf Storm in English. These are the things that writers learn how to do. They're mainly in one point of view. So that short novel about the Colonel is told from the Colonel's point of view, and he's basically going to the post office every week, waiting for his severance check to come from the military, because he fought in the war, in some sort of revolutionary war. Some of the characters from Solitude show up here for the first time. And as a result of having done this thing for his country, he thinks he's going to be paid a pension. And he goes every week to the post office, and it never comes. That's the joke of the story. And in the course of waiting for these checks to come, his whole life financially disintegrates. It's a real common kind of naturalistic story. You see it all the time in American novels, particularly early 20th century. The Sister Carrie types, or the Martin Eden types, who are just working, and they never make any money. They never have enough money. Upton Sinclair type territory. But his are they're villagers. They live in this small world of Recondo, and technically just really sharp stories. So that long novella that's told from the point of view of the colonel, and then we have a story. One of my favorite stories is a long story about a thief named Damaso, in a story called "There Are No Thieves in This Town," and it's about a young man who breaks into the pool hall where he hangs out and steals some the pool balls. He's got a bag of these balls from the pool table, and he can't sell them, and he can't go back to the pool hall, and the pool hall gets closed, and it's what his life is like. And it's a very basically realistic story. Most of these stories are extremely realistic, objective, narratively very simple stories, but you really get involved in the characters, and they're the sort of characters who populate 100 Years of Solitude, but often without the fantastic events. There's a story in here called One Day After Saturday, where we see him sort of playing with the ideas of the fantastic events. And again, you have two sets of people in Marquez's world. You have the people who live and work and have no money and who are totally screwed over, and then you have the political people, like the mayors and the military people and any bureaucrat and the Catholics, the Catholic Church, any of the ministers, and they're all just running things and living fat, and everybody else gets nothing. And there's a funny story in which, in the town of Macondo, birds start falling from the sky. And it's a perfect little Marquez story. But the main story is about the people who live there, just as it is in 100 Years of Solitude. There's a political edge to all of these stories. And there's also page after page, really, really nice, funny lines. I'll just give you a few examples of what I think are lovely lines. No One Writes the Colonel. The Colonel says, "All my comrades died waiting for the mail." Like he's the last one of this military group who tried to do their service to the country. And the post office man says to him, "Human ingratitude knows no limits." It's one lovely little moment after another in these stories. At one point, another person, I think it's the post office man again, says to the old man, "The only thing that comes for sure is death, Colonel. The letter may not come, but death will eventually come for you." There's a funny story about there's a mayor, some horrible mayor, very brief story, who was responsible for betraying the revolutionary soldiers, and they were executed as a result. And one day the dentist in town sees the mayor come into his office, and he gets to remove his wisdom tooth, and he enjoys the pleasure of giving pain to this evil old mayor. The final story is called Big Mama's Funeral, and this is some matriarchal character in town who's clearly financially tied into everything and is controlling everything and is implicated in everybody's lives. And she's some sort of big kind of capitalist entrepreneur. And it's about how when she's buried, everybody is connected to her, and she was connected to everybody. And she's obviously this sort of corrupt, manipulative old woman who died. And at the end, there's always these kind of little images for Marquez of the evil of the political hypocrisy of most of these people. At the end, after all these big shots and all the local big shots leave, and everybody who knew Big Mama leave the funeral, there's a little line at the end about how the street sweepers are going to sweep up the garbage, as they will be for many years. So there's always these little zingers of a political concern in Marquez. But ultimately, each of the stories that works is because he's technically right on his characters, so the point of view is clear in almost every story. He doesn't play a lot of fancy games when you get into 100 Years of Solitude, we shift through time, we shift through space, we shift through points of view. We are going through reflections of one person remembering another time in which something happens to somebody else. So you have this very multi-perspective, complicated, surging narrative, which I would like to read again in the bathtub. But when you see a good writer, they don't start to that. And whenever I see somebody, and I can't tell you how often it happens, come into me with this trilogy they're working on. They're working on a trilogy, and they haven't written the fine, clear, sharp stories, which I think are as good. I mean, I enjoyed reading this book again as much as I remember enjoying anything by Marquez. So when you read any writer who you like, don't just read the big shot books that win the Nobel Prize. Read their whole career. Sometimes you'll be disappointed because when you read the whole career of someone who has a big shot novel, there's a lot of the Booker Prize, history of the Booker Prize is filled with these characters. They wrote some stupid book, it got the Booker Award, and all the rest of their books are awful. Marquez is good for a long period in his career, and I have to be honest with you, I haven't read since 100 Years of Solitude. I sort of didn't want to spoil it. And I always had the feeling he would never do that, he'd do as well again, which is unfair to him. So I want to go back and reread all of his work, especially his last 20 years of work. But always go back and check their first book or two out, because then you can tell. That's when you really find out if they were good writers. Anyone can. Some people come along, they write a great book, great, or a book that's considered great. But if you can see them even in their smaller stories, in their early stories, doing all the basics and really getting involved in the fiction, which is what he does in this book. So I really recommend it. And again, don't read it in these big collected stories. I think that just takes the air out of the room when you get these big fat books of all his short stories. These were two very small books he published, and they're strong books, and they're almost perfect books. And just read them as he originally presented them. I think that's a good way of seeing how Marquez's early work develops. It's a good book. It's as good, to my mind, as any of his books that I have read. Okay. We'll see. I'm going to do a few little kind of one-offs, brief one-offs, and jump around a bit generically, genre-wise, and we'll see you in the bathtub. Okay, bye.